Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. And welcome to the INET discussion on the question of what is happening to Europe. Is this Europe's Hamiltonian moment, or is it the beginning of the end? And frankly, I can't think of a better time to be discussing this, because not only did we have the extraordinary German Constitutional Court ruling just the other day, but we also had in the last 48 hours the news that Angela Merkel from Germany and Macron from France are essentially pulling together to try and explore joint bond issuance, which is quite a pivotal moment. So we have a fantastic group of people to discuss this. I'm with the Financial Times newspaper, but I'm also an INET board member. But with us this morning, we have Laurence Boone, who is the chief economist at the IMF. We have Adam Tooze, who's from Columbia University, and Moritz Schularick, who is an economist, a professor of economics at Bonn, who's also an expert in debt. So we're going to start by really framing the question of whether Europe by looking at the macroeconomic picture with some comments from Laurence, and then widen it up to a bigger discussion about where Europe is going in terms of its political economy. And I should say that towards the end, there will be a chance to ask questions. So do please get any questions you'd like to ask prepared, and we'll call on you later. So over to you, Laurence. Tell us, what is the state of Europe's economy right now? Just how bad is it? And what are the key issues we need to be looking at, or the key statistics?
Thank you, Jean. So I think thanks for the invitation first from INET, and also I'm the OECD chief economist, but thanks for the promotion on the way, or the equivalent. Very quickly, I think to set up the stage, what I wanted to talk about here is really the divergences that we are seeing taking place with the COVID crisis and widening with the policy support that's being provided by the various governments. So let me first show you, can you all see the screen? Let me first show you then what happened in economic terms. And on the left-hand side, you have Q1 GDP for this year. And bear in mind that we only had like 1 to 2 weeks of confinement, and you can already see that the hit to GDP was markedly different across country, with some divide between the south and northeast of Europe, roughly. And you can imagine what it will be when we look at Q2 with quite different confinement measure across Europe. And indeed, what you see on the right-hand side is exactly an intuition about this, because this is the retail and recreation mobility. And here again, and it's in about the same order, we can see that in the south, the confinement is implemented much more strictly, that has much more effect on mobility than what it has in the north. Then if we move to policy support, what we really are seeing here is that policy support also differs across countries and with the same type of divide. On the left side, the little blue bar, they show you the direct spending or tax reduction. And there again, the country doing the most is Germany. The country doing very little is Italy, and roughly the support which is being provided depends on the initial perceived fiscal space. And on the right-hand side, you have the state aid subsidies to various firms across country. This is very, very striking, because Germany has distributed close to 1 trillion in terms of state aid. And if you look at the south of Europe, like for example, Italy being in orange, it's only 15% of the total EU state aid, or 300 billion. So again, you know, they enter the crisis differently hit by the virus, different confinement, and then different policies, and all going into the same direction. So just to, my last point on this, to complete the stage setting, is this is happening in an EU which was already subject to divergence across the same country. And what you can see on the left-hand side chart is the gap between the north, so Netherlands, which is basically represented as a share of Germany. So Netherlands income per head roughly was higher than Germany, but roughly stable, even if it took a little hit with the crisis. Italy was, or Spain even was much below. There was little convergence in the run-up to the great financial crisis. Then it started diverging again. And what we have just said now is that this divergence runs the risk of being accentuated. And all this, I think, in part, and perhaps we disagree on this, but because of the policies that have been implemented in the financial crisis without an appropriate policy mix of monetary and fiscal policy, and until yesterday, perhaps we run the risk of seeing the same situation, which would have accentuated fragmentation in Europe. And on this, I stop.
So, well, that was not incredibly encouraging, I think we could say, because what we've seen is a Europe which was facing strains even before the COVID-19 crisis hit. And as Laurence said, in many ways, what's happened is threatening to accentuate or increase that policy divergence and make those challenges worse. Adam, you are an economic historian. You've looked through the sweep of financial globalization. When you look at Europe today, and see that data, see what's happened in the last couple of years and see the challenges now, do you think that Europe is in danger of splitting up? Because sitting here in New York, as both you and I are, that's really the number one question that a number of my American friends keep asking.
Yeah, hi Gillian, it's great to be here. Hi Laurence, hi Moritz. I've just been told my internet connection is unstable, so I hope it holds up. I agree, Gillian. This is a question that is perennially asked by people speaking in English with English and American accents. I think it's the wrong question. I think what we've learned is that the real risk for Europe is not that it will break apart, but that it will become a very bad marriage. The problem is not that it's going to disintegrate, but that the costs of leaving the relationship are vastly too high for anyone serious to contemplate them. But on the other hand, our ability to move out of the increasingly damaging relationships that we've caught in, that Laurence has sketched for us so succinctly with that data, are enormous. And this ultimately is a political question, and it's a question of moving the politics in several different key member states at once. And since there's been so much action, and then since this is a moment in which both Moritz and I are relatively, as it were, connected to the conversation going on in Germany, I thought it might be worth just focusing for a couple of minutes on that side of the problem. All sorts of pieces have to move, and the movement that we've seen on the Italian, the Spanish, the French side has been highly significant. But I think we all agree that Germany is the veto player here. And so it's worth saying a couple of things about the politics of what's been going on in Germany. We have a German finance minister who gave an interview in the last couple of days to a leading German liberal newspaper declaring a Hamiltonian moment, that this is a moment for a Hamiltonian move. The details of what that actually means is perhaps something that Moritz can outline for us in greater detail. But I think it's worth stepping back and asking what is the condition of possibility for that? And we have to put politics back into the picture here. We talk too often in generalized terms about national governments as though they didn't have inner workings, as though they represented just national interest. And the same German finance minister, Olaf Scholz, did in fact start his term in office by saying, first and foremost, I'm a German finance minister, which is unfortunate because it obscures the changes that are going on. In the period that Laurence focused on, where that divergence widened massively, Germany had a coalition government which was of the right center, CDU, FDP, strongly nationalistic, very conservative in its approach to fiscal policy. Currently, Germany has a coalition government and the finance ministry is controlled by the Social Democrats. And a lot of the energy and the shift that we're beginning to see on the German side, the tolerance for a new set of conceptions about economic policy that we're seeing on the German side is coming from that social democratic controlled finance ministry. Does it meet the standard of a Hamiltonian moment? The ministry is in fact being completely explicit about what they take to be their template, which is a working paper published by Bruegel in 2012 by Randall Henning and Martin Kessler. It was invoked by one of the state secretaries on Twitter this morning. That sets a very high bar, because what that spells out is that the Hamiltonian moment in the United States emerged from profound political conflict. It went on over many years and it met three essential criteria. First of all, the no bailout clause at the center was met by local initiatives to limit budget deficits. Secondly, the limited maneuver of the individual states within the US Federation was offset by very substantial counter-cyclical capacity at the federal level. And thirdly, the huge potential costs from bank failures were substantially offset by a federal responsibility for managing banking crisis. Now, that is the agenda of Europe. That has been the agenda of Europe since 2012, but we are making baby steps towards that. And I think the movement that has been announced that was prepared by very serious conversations between the French Treasury and the German Finance Ministry that Macron and Merkel put their names to this last week, is a step in that direction, but all of the hard negotiating still has to be done, because the issue of basically what revenue flows will stand behind the debt is left to be decided. The Germans have announced that they intend, I think, to play hardball, and this is where social democratic politics reveals its other face, which is they're going to insist on a serious conversation about taxes within the EU, and they want, if Olaf Scholz has his way, for that to be decided by majority vote. That is a signal to both the Dutch and the Italians that both of them have questions to answer about their fiscal apparatuses. The political question is, and I'll wrap up with this, is will this declaration by Macron and Merkel have any greater substance than the famous Merseburg declaration, which I think came out in the summer of 2018, which went precisely nowhere and was whittled away? And the crucial conversation that has to be had in the next couple of weeks to see whether we can meet the challenge that Laurence described and that emerged in that fatal period really between 2009 and 2013 is whether Paris and Berlin have the political will to overcome the resistance they're already encountering in European meetings from three key players who are the Austrians, the Dutch and the Danes. Two of them are controlled by social democratic governments. So social democracy by itself doesn't make you pro-European. It can also make you, as it were, a nationalist defender of a national welfare state. But I think this is really the political challenge for progressives in Europe, is to identify a program of risk sharing and burden sharing that can actually be made to work and that can override these political logjams and these multiple vetoes within the system.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, if I was to give the Cliff Notes versions to people who aren't watching Europe closely, it's that this could be incredibly significant, but there are huge hurdles to overcome and we don't quite know yet. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. It's a promising move. This is remarkable what we're seeing. It is finally the opening in German politics that many of us have hoped for. It began at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, where we saw a consensus across conservative to progressive German economists in favor of Corona bonds. That has evaporated. This has emerged instead. Everything is to play for at this moment.
Right. Well, Moritz, Adam said that you were going to explain to us what's actually really going on. And you're in a fantastically good position to do that, because you're not only professor of economics, but you're also very much involved in a lot of the forums and discussions right now with the German Finance Ministry and other economists and academics about how to make sense of what's happening. So tell us what's really going on.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Adam. It's a massively positive step in the right direction. That is, engineered by a very competent team. I think that's fair to say, at the Finance Ministry, that understands the dimensions of the challenge that the European economy faces in this COVID crisis. So, effectively, for the first time, we will, if that Macron-Merkel proposal sees the day, we will have a very significant deficit spending on the European level. By Brussels. So the Commission will effectively borrow 500 billion euros, and those 500 billion euros will be not dispensed as loans, but they will enter and go through the individual member states according to where the damage from the pandemic has been largest through the normal budget. Look, there's many open questions as to how the money will be spent, what criteria will be applied, and I think it's actually now also up to the Commission to show that they can do something really useful, and I'd be hopeful if they really manage that big pot of money competently, and Europe gets out of this crisis in better shape than it did after 2008-9, and doesn't lose further ground to the US and China. That could be a massively positive step, but I think there's also a challenge now for the Commission to use that money and show what they can do with it. I think in terms of the Hamiltonian moment that you talked about, I think people in Berlin understand that what this would set in motion is potentially an interesting dynamic, in the sense that what we will have now is we have a bunch of debt on the European level, but as Adam said, we don't quite know how to pay for it. So we have a situation where there is a center now that has these obligations, and that could create a dynamic where more and more resources in the form of taxes or other income, we're talking about the revenues from the emissions trading system, for example, or the CO2, generally the CO2 taxation could be transferred to Brussels and sort of form a basis for a larger counter-cyclical policy at the center. So I think that's a dynamic that we'll have to watch. That could be potentially very interesting if we can overcome these veto players that Adam has mentioned. So all in all, a very big positive step.
Right. I mean, Laurence, I'd like to ask you, from the point of view of the OECD, who at the end of the day is not making prescriptions about whether Europe should or should not unite usually, but simply trying to make sure the economies are vibrant, is this going to help European growth and help close the gaps that you've highlighted in those slides?
As Moritz and Adam said, it's definitely a significant step forward. Now, if I have to be the one that highlights some of the limits of what we've seen, let me start with just one positive remark. I think the difference with Heisenberg is the sense of German commitment that we felt. Because if you remember Heisenberg, there was no number. The fact that you put a number on the table, I think, when you're a diplomat, it's an anchor. So from that standpoint, I think it's a decisive moment. There's one thing which I think will be very important for this to be efficient and matches some of the criteria that Adam and Moritz were mentioning is, this will have to be disbursed on the basis of the economic damages that the pandemic has created, not on the basis of death criteria or health criteria. First, because it was very different across country, and secondly, because we cannot even measure death in the same way. So it has to be economics, because otherwise it's the only way to include all of the countries that have been affected. The other thing I think which is super important for me is you put the number into perspective. And again, I'm not downplaying it at all. 500 billion over 3 years, we need more. The damages that are being done to the economics by the pandemic and the shutdown is enormous. And we're talking about deficits, across some countries of the order of 10% and very low growth for a prolonged period of time, because we're not reopening everything, because borders are remaining unevenly open. Some sectors will be in disarray. So we need much more. So we had some others in loan, the order of 540 billion, the first package. But one thing which is important is that for the EU negotiation, this should be considered as a floor. Let me just remind you, when we talk about Hamilton, and I speak under the control of Adam, federal spending in the US is 20% of GDP. And we're very, very far away from this.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I must say, I think one of the reasons why the Hamiltonian tag has caught on in America is because, most Americans are completely baffled by what's happening in Germany, let alone the EU most of the time. They've all been to see the musical, and it's one nice, neat way to try and capture what's going on. So I look forward to one day seeing the musical out of Brussels called what? Maastricht, Schengen, something like that. But sorry, Adam, I cut you off. I saw you about to say that. Are you going to contest the idea that 500 billion isn't enough?
Oh, no. I was going to heartily applaud Laurence. I mean, the comparison, to my mind, I didn't want to be cruel, and I don't want to deflate this balloon, but it's at some level absurd. But it's worth remembering how quickly this can move. At the beginning of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the federal government in the United States was still only spending 1 or 2%. So in the course of a single crisis, the balance of spending can shift. Admittedly, of course, that was followed by World War II. But and in the Anglosphere, the war is routinely invoked as an analog to COVID-19. So yes, absolutely, Laurence is spot on. The scales are all off. But we shouldn't underestimate, if one is in the business of transformative politics, the potential of shifting the fiscal balance radically in the space of less than a generation. And that must be the European project now. I simply, as somebody who is, heart and soul committed to the project, don't understand how we can avoid that necessity of a transfer. It's interesting that, in fact, in Germany at this moment, and quite typical of German history, that the federal fiscal constitution is being discussed downwards as well. In other words, the same ministry has also made a proposal to reshuffle the balance of debt within Germany between local government, state government, and the federal level, because they're recognizing what we understand in the US as well. And this is where the entire conversation is going with stimulus in the US, that the front line in dealing with a crisis like this is not necessarily national government, even, especially in an enormous state like the US or a big entity like the EU, it's actually at the level of the city and the region. And if their balances are off, or if they're massively constrained by, zero deficit rules and debt breaks, then you don't get the counter-cyclical action that you need, which is what Congress is arguing about right now.
But I mean, I mentioned the word Hamilton, or I pointed out about the Hamilton musical, partly in jest, but partly to illustrate a serious point, which is that, that musical did an amazing job of communicating quite a complicated concept from history to a mass market and making it trendy and cool. And in some ways, perhaps getting public buy-in. And so much of the American sense of identity and the vision economy shaped by these myths about great leaders. Europe absolutely lacks that. And I'm curious, Moritz, is there a sense of public buy-in inside Germany to do these kinds of things? Are people crying out for a kind of, is there a mythology building around what Germany should or should not be doing to back this? Or is it still very much a question of elites imposing this on everyone else? And what would the musical be called?
It's a very good question. I think there is an understanding that the fortunes of the German economy are so closely intertwined and linked with the rest of Europe that it is in the German self-interest to help and share fiscal capacity in times of need. You capture positive externalities. But I mean, that's an economic narrative. I think that's understood. It's understood if you, for example, look at what the big employers associations have done. They've been very open, very positive, very pro-European. Also in this debate, they've been effectively pushing the federal government towards more action on the European level. So there's a fear that the European project, the common market, could suffer. People are very unhappy also about the border closures. So there is an important and influential part of German society that pushes in that direction. But obviously, there's also a very deep-rooted fear and history, coming from history about, let's call it fiscal overburdening, about the actions of the ECB, the bond buying programs, and possibly German taxpayers being perpetually on the hook for costs incurred in other countries. So I think we're in an interesting moment. I think it's not black or white, and I think there is there's also a very strong, open, and European current in German society. And if I can just add that, what we've done now, there was an argument that was often made, and I don't know how many times I've heard that, was that deficit spending, borrowing on the EU level, euro bonds that we get now effectively, were legally impossible. It's not possible under the treaty. We can never do that. We would have to rewrite. And now we have a blueprint. Now we know if this proposal, because Merkel and Macron have checked this with the lawyers, it is possible. There is a blueprint. There's precedent for big spending, also deficit finance on the European level. And next time we are in a situation, it's one-off, it's limited right now, but the next necessity might be around the corner. Maybe the European banking system will need support coming from the center. There is now a blueprint for such actions, and let's hope that the dynamic that triggers goes in the right direction.
Well, I can see we've got lots of questions coming in already. If more of you do want to ask questions, please do send them over. And so I'm going to turn to questions in just a moment. Before I do, though, can either Adam or Moritz or Laurence, if you want to jump in, make sense of the significance of what happened with the German Constitutional Court and the ECB?
We should ask Moritz,
I mean,
really.
I can
You give your version, Moritz. I'll do another one.
Yeah. Okay,
but
well,
there's two different aspects to it. The first one is it's obviously about competences within what role does the nation state have, and what role does the center have, and who controls the sort of the guardians, the old question, like who actually decides whether something is legal or not. On the economic front, I think this judgment is very weak, and it effectively would be very hard even for the old model of the Bundesbank to fulfill what the Constitutional Court all of a sudden asked for, because the Constitutional Court effectively asked for the central bank to take into account all kinds of other aspects of effects of monetary policy has on, on employment, on the distribution, on interest income, on the wealth distribution, that are side effects of monetary policy. I think that is well established in the literature, but that typically the mandate, the independent mandate of the central bank, would enable them to not pay attention to in the same degree. And now that the court wants a proportionality assessment, for which, frankly speaking, there is no mandate and no good basis. How is the central bank going to decide between the distributional effects on savers in one asset versus savers in another asset? So that's something that is economically very difficult, and it would be, it's actually even against the background of the German model with a strong independent Bundesbank, that would struggle as much as the ECB to make sense of this. It is effectively something that we're seeing. It's something that puts central bank independence in question in a very substantial, very fundamental way.
So to put it in sort of street talk, Moritz, you think that what the Constitutional Court has done is nuts?
I mean, I would probably not use that word, but I think it's economically illiterate, yes.
It's okay. Highly political, Gillian. I mean, it goes directly to what we were talking about, the delicate balance of German public opinion. That's another key element to this. I mean, the German Constitutional Court is a highly political actor in the same way as the American Supreme Court is. It's very self-conscious in this role. It plays a very complicated role, but what they've chosen to do is to allow a particular conservative, nationalist. One of the complaints which they dismissed was that Mario Draghi was inadmissible as a president of the ECB because he was Italian. So, the sort of complaint they were hearing came from a founding member of the AfD. One of the people they were answering to was a founding member of the AfD. And they chose to give that suit the prominence that they did, and they allowed them largely to dictate, as Moritz is saying, the economic agenda. When the ECB is supposed to justify itself, it's supposed to justify itself to some of the most reactionary criticisms that have been made of central bank policy. So setting us, within the general question of how you construct an independent central bank, what the Constitutional Court has done is really taken kind of vox pop, as the Germans would say, beer table, Stammtisch type economics, and promoted that to the level of constitutional jurisprudence. So it's a very significant move politically, and shows how delicate really the room is within which Merkel and Scholz are operating. The AfD, let's not forget, originally was not a party of anti-immigrant politics. It was originally an anti-ECB and anti-Mario Draghi party. We saw the ugly face of that last year in 2019 when Draghi pivoted to QE, an overt attempt to intimidate Christine Lagarde as she came in as president of the ECB by a Bundesbank old hands. This is also a face of German politics that one has to take seriously.
Right. Well, I'm going to... Yes, please, Laurence. Yes, because...
I think there's something good which is coming out of this, because the balance between fiscal and monetary policy, and both Adam and Moritz know that by heart, was very uneven. And in fact, monetary policy has been the cement of Europe. It was a technocratic cement, and it was, to achieve their objective, the ECB had to do more and more, whereas the fiscal side has to do something. And in a way, I think what's coming out of this discussion is this has pushed and the political leader, the one who are actually managing the fiscal side, to move ahead. And in that direction, so to rebalance what's happening. If you in the summer of 2014, before Jackson Hole, Mario Draghi actually called for having a complete policy framework where he would do the monetary side, and then Europe would do the fiscal side for demand, and countries would do their structural policies. And I think we've been working on one leg, and now the second leg, you know, is taking shape, and that's good.
That's a great point. Now, I'm actually going to turn to questions right now, because as I say, we do have a lot of questions coming in. Do send them. I have a number of questions for Laurence in relation to the charts, but before I pick up on those, let me quickly turn to combine a couple of those, which is these. Pascale Izo asks question, the Dutch Prime Minister Rutte just said on behalf of the, quotes, frugal four, that a counter proposal will be made based on the loan structural reform logic, and a German government proposal said the spokesman said the proposal is not about joint borrowing or Eurobonds. Are we really sure this will not become just another Messersburg 2, which actually dovetails with the question that Anatol Koletsky asked, which is, can you ask Moritz to respond to Adam's concerns about why should we believe in this given the failure of the Messenberg 2 initiative and vetoes from the Frugal Four? So I think, Moritz, that's one for you. Is this just going to become a Messenberg 3?
Well, I hope not. I'm positive. I'm more optimistic than that for the reason that Adam outlined at the beginning. I think there has been a push coming from the finance ministry, but this proposal that Macron and Merkel have put on the table has been endorsed very clearly and strongly by the CDU, by the main, and CSU, by the main, the other partner of the Grand Coalition, the bigger partner as it stands right now. So there is a big sort of endorsement and support coming from, I think, the main veto player really in European affairs in the German system, which is the parliamentary group of Merkel's own party. So I'll be optimistic that the positive there on the German side we won't see watering down. On the European side with the Frugal Four, that's more of a different question. It's a difficult question. It's clear that one country opposing this is enough. So we need unanimity. We're going to change the financing framework of the European Union so everyone can say no. And that's a good question, whether these four are just holding out to get something out of this that they might not otherwise, or whether they're really going to be in fundamental opposition. Generally speaking, I think it's in a joint Franco-German proposal that is endorsed by Spain, Italy, and a bunch of other countries, carries some weight in the European context. So it will be, and interesting, the Eastern Europeans as well are quite happy because they fear that otherwise they would lose quite a lot of money from the cohesion funds that are going east right now. So they are okay with the idea of having additional resources being brought to Brussels because that means there's less for them to lose. So I can see a situation where these four are quite isolated and we do not end up sort of in another Merseburg.
Right. Adam, do you have a comment on that? Because if not, I have another question to ask.
I think we don't know. There is a real risk that it could end up that way. It's all to play for, and indeed the four could veto, and then we'd be stuck.
What about another question, which is, do you think either of you, and then we will turn and turn to some of Laurence's points about the wider EU situation, but is there a chance that the EU debt finance will be challenged in the German Constitutional Court? That's from Katharina Pistor.
Katharina, yeah. You would know.
I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
We're all becoming fascinated by the German Constitutional Court.
I'm more likely to know the answer to that question than I am.
Moritz, what do you think?
As far as I know, and I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I know, given that we effectively increase the resources of the European Union with all the parliaments have to vote on this, we're increasing the budgetary framework of the European Union. Parliament says yes, that's the main concern that the Constitutional Court has, that there's some fiscal implications or fiscal decisions made on the European level that have not been okayed by the German Parliament. In this case, I think we're pretty clear.
Okay, well, And one other question related to this, if this does actually go ahead, and if it's not challenged by the by the German Constitutional Court or by the Frugal Four, we have a fascinating question to think about from Kathleen Stevenson, which is, which entity will be managing the borrowing and which credit rating do you think the EU bonds will have? Laurence, do you think that Europe deserves a AAA rating right now?
Actually, I think we should check what the there's a mechanism within the European Commission, which is called the balance of payment. That's for EU non-Euro member who runs into difficulty and they can borrow money. My guess is it's got a very high rating because it's backed by the EU budget. So it's fully backed. So it's probably going to be something close to that or to the ESM. I would guess the rating would be effectively very good. I would add to something that Moritz was saying. It's a very traditional way of working for the EU, that what we are seeing now, this Franco-German declaration, which is very strong, much stronger again than Mesenberg last time. And you know, you were seeing some kind of fragmentation between the North and the South, but what France and Germany are doing now is building up a bridge between the two opposites and also with the two, sorry, not opposite, the two senses and the East. And traditionally, that's how it happened. You build up a consensus between Germany and France, and then the European Commission goes around and gathers all the other countries around this consensus. So the question mark is whether we are stepping back in time and coming back to this traditional method of working, and that may well be the case. But we'll know next week when the Commission presents the project.
Right, right.
Technicalities aside, the real issue, I think, in terms of the credit rating is what is going to be the revenue flow that will back this up. And that the memorandum, and we've seen this consistently in the positions being taken by the German Finance Ministry, is opening a huge can of worms with this question of discussions, Europe-level discussions about taxation. One route to go down, which Moritz highlighted, would be the carbon pricing mechanism, which generates a flow of income. But it's quite clear the German Social Democrats want to raise two issues. One is the tax loopholes and tax evasions, which the Dutch, the Irish, and so on specializes. And the other one that they want to raise, and this has very compelling political reasons behind it in Germany, is the figures which show the substantial wealth holding of Italian households. And what the German Social Democrats want to push, if necessary by majority vote, is a, as it were, European audit of tax systems, wealth and income tax systems. And that is a huge, it's dynamite politically. So this is by no means a pushover. No one should imagine that there is some very serious political material. This isn't just a technical fix. There's some very serious and heavyweight political issues lurking there in this proposal.
Yeah, and right. And maybe to pick up on this last point, we will be in a few years, let's call it 5 years, we will be in a situation where we will start, maybe it's 10 years, the later the better, but we will be in a situation where we have to pay back these Euro bonds, this Commission borrowing, because the Macron-Merkel plan foresees that there is going to be a redemption plan attached to it. So we'll be in a situation where we have to make repayments, but we need to then the nation states, the member states need to come up with the resources for that repayment. So we'll be in a situation where there's a big incentive to give resources to the center, because otherwise you have to pay that out of national budgets. So to create taxes on the European level that could then be used to service that debt is an interesting dynamic that is part of that proposal, because no one in 5, 6, 10 years time will be happy to transfer additional resources to Europe. It will be much easier to say, like, okay, let's give new revenues to the center.
Right, right. Well, we have a question perhaps for Laurence here, which is how should the EU fiscal stimulus be used to revive potential growth?
I can't hear you, Gillian.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
No, you're like a robot.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me
No, I think we can't hear you, but I guess your question, you can nod, is about how to spend the money. we've talked about the revenue side, and you want to talk about
yes,
the
yes.
side. Okay. So again, I think what's very important is the criteria, and they shouldn't focus on health impact only, but really on the economic impact of the joint health economic crisis. One thing we haven't discussed there yet is it's supposed to be part of the usual rhythm of the European budget and macroeconomic analysis. So it will be monitored by the European Commission, and it should be dispatched according to where each country stands with respect to its capacity to grow. And then in my view, there will be two things coming out of this crisis. One is it affects a lot more low qualified people who cannot telework. And so there should be a lot of money designed to actually retrain these people and help accompany them into their new job. That will be essential. The other thing is what we haven't seen on the chart, but you know, investment has not recovered since the financial crisis. And I think there are at least three in terms of investment. One is obviously digital, and you're going to tell me, okay, we always talk about digital investment, true, but now it's essential for two things. One is we have to admit that we are in this position where we will have to telework and do digital stuff for a long time because we don't have a treatment or a vaccine. So you want to equip small firms, you want to equip people and schools and universities, and that's super important for you know, paving the way for better growth looking ahead. The other thing is without digitalization, we cannot have green growth. If we want renewable to pick up to a large extent, we need super efficient digital grid that can match production and consumption. So I think these three things, you know, people and a job, digital for education and for work, and then for green growth are super important. And they should be decided, the way to spend should be decided at the national level, because we will need a lot of very granular information to be sure that the money goes exactly where it's needed.
Right. We also have a number of questions about the Green New Deal. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Yes, that's better.
So can a Green New Deal be created by financing through CO2 taxes and spending towards decarbonisation of the economy? That's from Jose Navarro. Laurence, would you like to deal with that?
I was looking at Aaron. He's into climate questions, but I think it's part of what I want to say is it is exactly what I wanted to say, in the sense that there's precedent now. If we decide as Europeans that there are European public goods that should be financed from the center, that could be, you know, it could be an energy transition, it could be infrastructure. That could be, I think, development aid is something that has been mentioned in the German debate quite often. That these are things that, you know, naturally, actually, there's a point that this should be done at a European level. There is no point that we have like 17, 18, or 27 even individual development agencies if we agree anyways on what should be done. That this mechanism, this precedent that we have now, enables us to have a proper discussion. And when we say this should be done on the European level, then we can come up with resources for Europe to sustain that. And I think that's maybe the most significant step that has been taken now, is that this argument that was always in the room, it's impossible, the treaties forbid joint debt, is no longer binding. And we have a way, a valid way, as I believe, to transfer resources to the center and even engaged in new deficit spending if need be. But I think these are two different questions, but let me give it over to Adam.
Well, I'm still getting lots of questions coming through. Adam, do you want to comment on that, or should we turn to the ECB?
The thing I would have thought, I was actually keen to hear Laurence, but the thing I would think is important is a minimum carbon price floor. Because that's currently not provided for in the emissions trading system. It's been the downfall of that system in previous cycles. It worked very well in Britain And with the collapse in oil and gas prices that we're seeing globally right now, it's urgent that we maintain the momentum. And to do that, we need to set an ambitious minimum floor and keep pushing on it. And that is also a mechanism for generating revenue if necessary. So that would be my tuppence on that. But I see Laurence wants to come in.
Yeah, I know the OECD has looked at carbon taxes a lot, haven't you?
Yeah, among other things. But just to point, reacting to what Moritz and Adam were saying, I think in terms of spending, what you want to do is to correct the imbalances that we've described at the beginning, as well as to promote this Green New Deal. But bear in mind that the first thing was to do that. In terms of New Deal, I think we can be transparent that it's going to be very difficult to have sustainable green growth without a carbon price. I completely agree with Adam. At the same time, we know from experiences in Chile, in France, in Australia, in many countries that from a political economy viewpoint, it's super difficult to implement. So I think, you know, and what's very interesting if you look at a lot of papers on political economy innovation is it's easier to put that in place if you compensate the people who suffer from it, because you don't want to raise revenue with that, you want to change behavior. So for that, you need to actually see who it's affecting the most, like the people with, you know, wages below the median and living in a rural area, needed their car. You need to compensate them and to give some invitation for them to change their behavior. Some people will not believe that you're raising carbon taxes for green purposes. They will believe you're doing that just because you want the cash, but that's not what you want to do. You want it to change behavior.
In the US, they're playing around with the carbon dividend idea, whereby you give it back to people, and that's getting potentially much wider political buy-in than what's perceived as simply a tax to collect money. But we have a number of questions about the ECB and about its monetary policy stance. Guillermo Ria Zapatero asks, should the Fed program be a model for an EU Hamiltonian moment? And we also have a number of questions along the lines of, from Vinit Sharma, will negative monetary policy rates lead to Japanification of the EU economy with low productivity? What about financial zombies, etc., etc.? Any of you wish to address that?
I can.
Laurence.
No, I was just about to say quickly, not so much negative rate for Japanification or zombification. The issue is whether you have the energy. Actually, two things. Let me start again. Yes, it's true that it's this crisis. We're going to see a rise of NPL and we have very low productivity, but we also have a rise of savings. And if we don't invest enough, then interest rates will continue to go down. And that is the real cause of Japanification. What we actually need is two things. The first thing is the ability to actually close down some business, but help the people and the guys who had the business to do something else and quickly. And the other thing is to invest, and that's why we need fiscal policy, and that's why this Hamiltonian moment is so important as well, because that's the way to actually get out of zombification or Japanification.
I would simply say that if the EU or the Eurozone had ever had the option of picking Japan's combination of macroeconomic and socioeconomic fundamentals any time in the last 20 years, we should have bitten the hand off that offered it to us. They have negligible unemployment. Once you adjust for their declining population growth, they have steadily rising per capita income, immediately comparable with that of the United States. It is a far preferable mixture to anything the Eurozone has been able to realize for its citizens anytime recently. They have not had the egregious policy failures that the Eurozone has suffered through in the last 12 years. I mean, we should take it. The problem is that by Japanification, people don't actually mean the real experience of Japan. They mean some caricature. But, you know, just talk to the citizens of Italy as to whether or not they would like the Japan mix and explain to them what it actually consists of. No one wouldn't opt for it. It's a highly effective model for an extremely advanced, affluent society. It's by no means a nightmare.
No, but I think we should be careful in fact, I think you're right. We shouldn't talk about Japanification, you can talk about firm zombification, but there are also some, you know, structural differences. For example, you look, I mean, I don't want to play the feminist advocate here, but look at the labor participation of women. Look at, you know, there are many issues and they vary from country to the others. In Japan, it's very low, as you know.
It's surged, though, in recent years, right? So Japan is not a static model.
No, but that's exactly the point, and neither is Europe, by the way.
And the problem in Europe is that it's regressing so badly, right? I mean, one of, to my mind, most striking comments that Mario Draghi ever made was in early 2012 in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, when somebody asked him, well, doesn't the fiscal compact that we're still talking about now mean the sacrifice of the European social model? And he just looked at the interviewer and said, what social model? Unemployment amongst young people in Italy is 25%. What are we kidding ourselves about? I mean, we need to be realistic about the damage that's actually being done, I think.
But I think the damage to the young people will be done across the world. We were talking about Hamilton at the time, but Schuman said something which, talking about Europe, saying that it will be built through concrete achievements, which first create a de facto solidarity. And I think that's probably what we are seeing now. So as no is static, as you reminded us, I think this one is not either.
Nicely, another question. We are sadly getting very out of time. I should say we've had an extraordinary volume of questions, of which I should say probably half to 2/3 are about Germany and about what's happening with this $500 billion proposal. But here's one which leads on to this about Italy. From Mark Ditley, you all say this is a good first step, but nowhere near enough in terms of the amount needed. How big is the risk that in order to calm the frugal four, it won't be more than 500 billion euros and will leave Italy and Spain overwhelmed with the economic cost of COVID-19, opening the path to a long-lasting economic depression?
Questions for me?
Yeah, Moritz.
I didn't quite get the first half, but I think it's about the size and whether it's enough and how much time do we have to do this. I think also coming back to what was previously said, I think after 2008, after the great financial crisis, we've lost a decade in Europe, and I think it has cost the European project dearly, politically and economically. And we definitely we can't lose another decade. I think it's the time to be bold. Is 500 billion bold enough? I mean, it comes on top of, it's about 4% of GDP. It comes on top of, so that's significant for a sort of counter-cyclical, if it comes on time, at least counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus. It's not quite the Obama 2009 stimulus, but it is a significant amount. And it comes on top of what has already been agreed, the SURE program to prop up the unemployment benefits, some EIB lending. I don't know, I don't have very high hopes for these programs, but it comes on top of that and on top of the national resources. The interest, I mean, this is sort of, we're lucky in this catastrophe that interest rates are so low, so that we have a lot of fiscal space. Even countries that are, I guess, at like high levels of debt to GDP can have market access. The ECB does its part. So there's a sense that I think that Europe actually does can get out of this crisis better than out of the last one. But it remains also very true, and I think coming back to Hamilton, that you know, the Eurozone is a currency without a state, as the saying goes, and it's a currency without a state that's hit by two once-in-a-century crises within a decade. And it's a very bad hand of cards that this young currency union was dealt, in a way. Yeah, it's not, we could have had 20 years to sort this out. And I mean, Hamilton 1790 is the first step. Came the 1840s, you know, the sort of to sort out the relationships between the individual states and the center. Then the Fed was founded in 1913. Deposit insurance introduced in the 30s. Roosevelt effectively set the stage for automatic stabilizers and redistribution on the national level. So we're talking about a 150-year process that, or even more, that got us to that setup in the US, and I guess also that is far from perfect. But the problem is that Europe doesn't have the time. So coming back to this, Hamilton is we make these baby steps, but and we're making them quicker, I think, in Europe than if you look at American history, America has done them. So, but they might still be too slow, I don't know. But I just wanted to give some perspective that we are time is of the essence, but also it takes time to do these things.
Right, right. Well, sadly, very, very sadly, we are pretty much out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, I must say, I take away sort of 2 or 3 key points. Firstly, as Laurence said at the beginning, you know, Europe went into the COVID-19 crisis in a pretty bad position, quite frankly, and COVID is threatening to exacerbate many of the forces potentially challenging its cohesion and creating a very serious economic threat in terms of the issues that it's facing. Secondly, what we've seen coming out of Germany and what we've seen coming out of the joint Merkel-Macron initiative is really quite extraordinary and potentially going to be quite transformational, but there are enormous hurdles and problems ahead. And it's clearly going to be absolutely critical what happens, not just economically, but also politically in the coming weeks. So if there was ever a time, as I said at the beginning, to be having this debate, it's now. If there was ever a time to keep watching very closely what all 3 of our panelists are talking about and writing on, it's certainly now, because this really is a fascinating moment for the wider world in terms of watching not just Germany, but the European Union and the Eurozone. So just remains for me to say a very, very big thank you to all of you for taking part in this discussion. There will be another very interesting discussion with Michael Spence tomorrow, looking at the global implications of COVID-19. So do tune in to the INET site for that as well tomorrow if you're interested. And in the meantime, I just say, once again, thank you to all of you. Thank you to the audience for your questions, which are terrific. And I don't think I've ever seen a panel with quite so many questions, or the proportion of questions to audience participants is extremely high. So clearly it's a very passionate, engaged audience, or it's a very, very hot topic, or both. But anyway, thanks to all of you. Best of luck in figuring out what's going to happen in Europe, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian.
Bye.
Thank you.